Hey there, thanks for joining us. This podcast is put out into the world by Living Water Community Church, located in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I'm Pastor Clark Cothern. If you'd like to know more about Living Water, or if you'd like to drop us a note, or if you've got a question, or if you'd like to have us pray for you, head on over to lw-cc.org. Now, let's join today's podcast in progress.
And we're wrapping up with part 4 of the S.H.A.P.E series. This is the final installment in our 4-episode series on our S.H.A.P.E. S.H.A.P.E stands for spiritual gifts, heart or passion, but H stands for heart, and otherwise if it was passion it would be S.H.A.P.E. So heart works well. So it's spiritual gifts, heart, abilities, personality, and experience. And we've been looking at how God gifts us with all these things so that He can put us to good work as we fit with other members of the body of Christ, fleshing out that which He's given us to do with His empowerment, because none of this emanates from us to start with. So that's where we are. Part 4, we're going to wrap it up today. I got to see philosophy put into practice one time. Many of you may have taken a course in school back along the way, and you thought, as you scratched your head, what use is this going to be for me in the future anyway? Some of you who are math teachers can probably say you have students who have asked that question. They'll say, when am I going to use this stuff? This is so boring, or this is so hard, or I don't want to learn this. How is this going to apply to my life? Well, I took a lot of math back in high school and college, and I finally got to see some practice. The philosophy started to be used right before my eyes, because as we were adding on to the sanctuary over at what was then Packard Road Baptist Church in Ann Arbor, now it's Crossroads Community, we had a guy who started sketching out some figures on an old plank. He just grabbed a scrap, and he had been doing a lot of measuring. He had sent some guy who wasn't afraid of heights way up to the ridge beam, and he said, okay, measure from this point to this point on the plate, now measure from this point to this point. And then he started scratching out some stuff, and he did it old school. This was no calculator handy. He did some algebra and probably some trigonometry. He may have gone into some gastronomy, I'm not sure. He really got into this thing. And then when he figured it all out, he got a little tool that looked like that, and he set it at a specific angle and put one edge of it up against the edge of a big, huge plank. It was like a 2x10 or 2x12. And then he also set his skill saw at an unusual angle. And then he looked at it a couple of more times. He double-checked his measurements. He was satisfied with the math, and he let her rip. Cut on this line, and it was the oddest looking cut, because it was not only an angle here, but it was angled this way. And then he had the people hoist that huge plank up to the top of the guy that was up there by the ridge beam, and he put his end down on the plate, and guess what? It fit. It was the perfect fit. And I thought, math works. This stuff has an application. It makes sense to me now. And sometimes we are guilty of putting forth all the theology or the philosophy behind stuff without saying, but this is how it works. And sometimes we need to get down to the nitty-gritty and say, now this is how we apply it. So today I'm only going to give you one more philosophical section. And our praise team helped us because they read through that 1 Corinthians 13, because that's really the philosophy behind what we're going to do. And then I'm going to give you 3 ways that you can put this stuff into practice, extremely practically, and I think it's going to start making real sense to you now. And if you've heard the first 3 sermons in the series, this 4th one is going to go light bulbs. We're probably going to have 1,000 watts over every head in this room today. Let's all make the sound of a gong together. We'll do it collectively. Ready? Gong. The gong is something that was important, and when you see in 1 Corinthians 13 where Paul is giving a list of a bunch of different gifts, in Romans he gives one group of gifts, 1 Corinthians 12 he gives another group, and then he goes into this love chapter. He's saying, if I had, fill in the blank, if I had the gift of tongues, if I had the gift of prophecy, if I have the gift of knowledge, if you could fill in the blank with any of the other gifts in the two lists that he's given for us in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, you could substitute any gift there but have not love. What is it? It's nothing. It's like a noisy gong or a cymbal. But what does that mean exactly? At surface level, you can say, well, that's not really nice and it's kind of irritating. Mark Elwell will testify to the fact that when you're sitting only a few feet away from the crash cymbal in a drum set on a platform, and when somebody is using these little tree trunks for sticks, and he's going wham, 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 right in your ear, it's not pleasant. In fact, I watched Mark, and he was very tactful, but he was sitting over there listening to the service like this. In one respect, just on the surface level, yeah, it's a noisy cymbal or a gong. It's something that's not very pleasant. It's jarring. So I get that. But I think there's another hint for us at the very beginning of 1 Corinthians 12 where Paul is saying, I don't want you to be uninformed like those pagans. He's thinking about pagan worship. And you know what they used to do in pagan worship? They would have to go into the temple, and first they had to wake the god up. They would have to get the god's attention by going gong. Or they would do so in such a manner that it would call attention to themselves, because they would say, I'm worshiping now. Can you see this? And of course, Christ taught against doing things to be seen by men. Like, don't trumpet your giving in the temple. They had those big things shaped like a trumpet, and you could throw your coins in there into the gift boxes. And they would do that and just chunk in all these huge coins to make it sound like, I'm wealthy and look how much I just gave. Woohoo! And he's saying, don't do that. We're not going to do this so that we can feel good about ourselves or other people can look at us and say, wow, he's more spiritual than I am. We're not supposed to do it to get God's attention. We're supposed to do it out of the right motive, which is love. That's why we have the whole 13th chapter there. Christ had even taught this as well. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. In other words, we can have people who could memorize all the definitions of all the spiritual gifts listed in the Bible, and they could give them to you meticulously and probably even administer a test for you and help you find out what your spiritual gift mix looks like. But if they have not love, all of that is for naught. But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ appointed it. I had to mark out one word that I had in my manuscript this morning, and I replaced it with another word because I realized, no, I'm not supposed to just season these gifts with grace. We're supposed to permeate every gift with grace. I wanted to use the word permeate because I wanted it to have an effect on every single one of everything that God has gifted us with. It all ought to be permeated with grace. A prophet without grace can become pugnacious. You know what pugnacious means? Eager to quarrel, eager to fight. I love a debate, and I'm going to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. Blah. That's pugnacious. A mercy shower without grace can become a couple of things. They can become resentful of other people who think that mercy shower might think, oh, that evangelist is too pushy. There's no grace in his or her life, and they need to take it down a couple of notches. And we need not be resentful of each other. That's exactly what Paul was saying. In one of the 4 messages we talked about, the foot shouldn't say to the eye, oh, well, I'm not an eye, so I'm not a part of the body. And we shouldn't measure one of the other parts of the body with our part of the body as the measuring stick, because we're all different. But the differences are for good. Or they can become compromising. A mercy shower can become compromising because they want so badly to make somebody feel good about themselves that if they came to them, for example, and said, oh man, I think I've done a bad thing. I think I've really sinned. I've blown it here. What do I do? Well, a mercy shower might be tempted to say, oh, what you did is not so bad. You know, we've all made mistakes. Just don't worry about it. You'll get over it. Well, sometimes the best thing we can do is tell the truth. And sometimes the mercy shower needs to show mercy while still saying, yes, what you did was bad. That's called sin. And the only way forward is to have that sin forgiven. But fortunately, I know somebody who forgives sin. Amen. Can you see how each of these gifts needs grace in order for them to become really effective? Those are just 2 really quick examples. The spiritual gifts tests, as I have even mentioned one of them to you. I commended them to you because it's something you can go easily and do online. My family, all 3 of us, sat around and had a discussion about our gift mixes. Joy discovered that hers hasn't changed in about 25 years. And that was no No surprise to me, I could have told her what her spiritual gifts were. Of course, I've lived with her for 40 years, so that helps. But Callie was a little bit affirmed in hers because she's doing some things already in ministry, and she thought, oh, I think I'm in the right spot. Because God is affirming for me that he's actually kind of wired me this way, and maybe that's why I enjoy this so much. So we had a good discussion about that. But the discussion is more important than the test. You can take the test, but that doesn't make you an expert on what your spiritual gift is. A couple of examples. Bill Wallace, I read his biography back in college. He was an amazing surgeon. He reminded me of the guy who performed the cesarean section surgery to get my son out from Joy, because Joy needed a C-section. And so Clarkie was born thanks to Tom Elkins, an amazing surgeon who would go over to different countries on mission trips and help do surgeries and train people how to do surgeries. Well, Bill Wallace was like that, and he went to China. And he was in a Baptist teaching hospital there in China, and there became the Boxer Rebellion, and some uprisings were happening, and some of the enemies were encroaching closer and closer to the area where that hospital was located. Finally, Bill told some of the other folks, the expatriates, he said, you need to go back to your home countries. It's too dangerous for you here. They said, well, what about you? And he says, well, somebody has to administrate the hospital. He says, I'm staying put. I'll be all right, but I need to stay put. I'm going to continue to do the work here. The trouble with that was he's a gifted surgeon. He was so gifted. He was so good at doing that, but he had to start spending 60 or 70% of his time doing administrative duties, which he really didn't enjoy, but there was nobody else left there to do it. What would have happened had Bill Wallace said, yeah, I'm a surgeon, and I'm too gifted to do that stuff, and I'm afraid that things are just going to have to fall apart administratively because I'm still doing surgeries? That wouldn't have made sense, would it? He rose to the occasion even though he was not the gifted administrator that somebody else might have been, and he still got the job done while he was there. Another name that I used earlier in the series, Eric Liddell, the Scottish runner, Chariots of Fire. He also became a missionary, and he was also in China. And many people don't know that he was much more than just an Olympic medalist runner. He went over there, and because he was good at organizing sports, he would organize the kids into doing little sports ministries and things while he was in the internment camp, after people had gotten him into an internment camp. But he also wrote a book on discipleship while he was there and taught weekly Bible studies. He was mentoring people in their faith because there was nobody else to do it. And Eric could have said, I'm a runner. God has made me to run. I feel his pleasure when I run. But instead, he said, yeah, I can do some sports, but that's not the main thing that needs to happen here. And even though there are some people who are probably a lot more theologically in-depth than I am, I'm the only guy around who has this knowledge, so I'm going to do it. And so he did it. He rose to the occasion. My mom, in her mind, to be a music leader in a church felt like she was sort of stepping into a role that she kind of wished that a man would do. And I think that was much more prevalent back in the 50s and 60s. And so she would go to these small churches that my dad was helping start, and there would be nobody there with the skills to lead music. And so Mom stepped up and she started leading music. But she would always say, as soon as God sends us somebody who's really skillful at this, I'm going to step right back into the shadows because I don't feel like this is my primary role. But there was rarely anybody there in these small churches, especially in the early stages of getting going. And so my mom stepped up to the plate and she led the music. My point is, we can lock ourselves in legalistically by taking a test and saying, this is my shape, and so I have to minister this way. Sometimes God's going to put us into a situation where it's absolutely out of our control, and we don't know what to do. This just popped into my head. It was a great memory. Ron Potter, a good friend of mine, mentor. He was my deacon when I was first starting to work in Ann Arbor. And I asked him, I said, Ron, you're meeting with huge executives. I mean, like Fortune 500 company executives, CEOs and the like, helping them do their jobs better. Have you ever run into a situation where you felt like you were way in over your head? He goes, oh, yeah. He said, probably a half a dozen times in 30 years. And I said, what did you do? He said, I prayed hard, I learned a lot, I got better, and I raised my rates. And that spoke to me because what he was saying was that learning experience made me more valuable. Yes, I was in over my head. Yes, I had to rely on other people to help me through it. Yes, I had to pray a lot. But God used that to help grow me to a new level as well. Sometimes we're going to be where nobody is around to use a specific gift, and we don't feel like that's a part of our gift mix. But guess what? You're the only one there. And so God's going to pour himself out through you in a way that you might not have ever thought he could do. And he's done that. I've had a couple of situations like that were very out of the box, rare experiences, including leading a vacuum salesman to Christ and having him kneel and accept Christ on my living room floor. That hasn't happened but once in my life. Kind of doubt that I'm going to go into the vacuum salesman evangelism. It was a one-time shot, and it was so weird, but it was like God had just aligned everything so perfectly that I could sense that he had led this guy just to that moment. Sometimes we're the only one there, and God opens the door. So that doesn't mean we stop because we're not gifted. It means, okay, God, here I go. Also, we need to rely on other people's shapes, too. This is the thing that I've continually kind of struggled with a little bit, and yet I've seen how wonderfully abundant God has blessed even our congregation. And I look at different people who have different skills. I've said it before, and on our first Haiti experience, we had all 5 elders down there at the same time. And it was so cool for me to see how 5 very different personality types meshed so incredibly well. It was like a puzzle. And God knew this person was really good at that, so let's get him in charge of this. This person is good at that. We had an extra person on that one, Bill, who was helping us with registration. We would have been a mess if Bill hadn't been there. There were all these different shapes at work, and none of us had prepared totally for that because it was a brand new experience. It was like Indiana Jones flying the plane out of place. I'm making this up as I go along. That's kind of how we felt some of the times, and yet God worked it out beautifully. Example of somebody that I have to rely on a lot as a mercy shower is my wife, Joy. That's one of her really top 3 in her gift mix. Now, if you want somebody who can sit with you and literally hold your hand for 4 hours while you pour your heart out because of a difficult experience, and then follow up with a phone call and maybe speak for an hour or an hour and a half or text that long daily for 2 or 3 more weeks after that, call Joy. Please don't call me. Because sometimes I'm a little bit more tempted to teach. And sometimes the mercy shower has to get you through the point until you're ready for the teacher to step in. You see what I'm saying? And God does that. And fortunately, he's gifted me with somebody who just makes up for that compliment side in me. And I'm grateful because God seems to sort of do a tag team mercy showing / teaching that goes on with both of us because God's gifted us differently that way. Here are 3 general categories. Now, I like this because if you can simplify it and make it super simple for me, then I know that other people might be able to get it too. All the other gifts that we can look at, we could try to shove them into different categories, but this one made a lot of sense. Jesus is the only person in history who fulfilled all 3 of these different areas, these roles. He was prophet, he was priest, and he was king. Now, if you want to separate those 3 things into categories and then lump different spiritual gifts under each of those 3, that gives you a fairly good idea of where, if you're going to do just a big 3-piece pie, which is about the size I like when we eat a pie, 1/3. If you have each of these in those areas, it helps you kind of see where you gravitate toward. And that's one of the things we're going to look at is gravitational. The prophet, the priestly, and the king. The prophet are those gifts that have to do with proclaiming truth. Priestly is caring for practical needs. Those are the people who feel like that they can best meet somebody's needs by doing something practical, helping feed them, helping clothe them. These would be people who would love to work downtown at the Hope Center. They're just a lot of people who do that because they want to meet practical needs. And then the kingly could also be used as administrative role. I think of that as the administrator. That's the person who wants to organize for action. And those are the 3 categories. Now, 3 practical discernment practices. Let me give you an illustration from a real pastor who had this happen to him. You know how a lot of times pastors would go to church and they would have to have their car in the parking lot so that if anybody drove by, they would see that the pastor is there and that they could jump in on him and just ask him a question at any time, day or night. But he was there. It was his first church. He was right out of seminary. First day, he says, I'm not making this up. First day on the job, I'm there in my office. The door, somebody knocks. Yes. Oh, hi. Hey, Pastor, I just wanted to welcome you. Can we step out on the front porch? I want to talk to you for a minute. He goes, sure, let's do that. Thanks for coming by so I can get to know you. They walk out on the front porch. First guy says, I just wanted to talk to you and tell you what the real problem with this church is. That's always the first thing you love to hear as the new pastor. I want to tell you what the real problem with this church is. Oh, okay, well, what's that? Right across the street from that church was a big mobile home park. And the guy said, you see that mobile home park? Pastor said, yep. He said, we're not evangelistic enough. And he goes, oh, okay. He said, there are people who are lost, and we need to get over there and evangelize the people in that mobile home park. That's the real problem with this church. We're just not evangelistic enough. Pastor said, well, thank you for letting me know that. Thank you. I'll be really pondering that and praying about that. So the guy leaves. He says, I'm not making this up. Second day, different guy. Hey, can I talk to you for a minute? Let's go out on the front porch. There's something about the front porch in this church. The guy says, I just wanted to come by and tell you what the real problem with this church is. Second day, second person, real problem. You see that mobile home park? Actually, I do. I do see that mobile home park. He says, well, you know what the problem with this church is? He says, what's that? We don't care enough about people's practical needs. He said, there are people over there, the kids that sometimes they have a hard time getting enough food by the end of the month, and they're going hungry. They don't even have enough food to make a sandwich to take to school for lunch. We should do something about the practical needs of those people right across our street. How can we expect to evangelize the world if we don't meet their practical needs first? And the pastor said, thank you for letting me know that. I'll be pondering that. The guy goes home. Third day. Pastor, shall we go out on the front porch? Good idea. Good idea. He goes, you know what I've come to tell you? He's thinking, I think I do. And he goes, I want to tell you what the real problem with this church is. He goes, what's that? He says, we're not organized. We're just not organized enough. He says, I don't fault people. They got good hearts. I know we got some people in this church, and they're all hot to trot to try to meet practical needs and stuff over there. And I know we got to reach people for Christ with evangelism and stuff like that. He said, but we're not organized enough. We need somebody to organize the troops and then kick us into action. We need somebody to push us and get us going in the right direction. The pastor said, I really appreciate that. Thanks for letting me know that. I'll ponder that and be praying about that. Now, who was right in those three people? They all were. Every one of them, they had a different gravitational pull for how they wanted to achieve meeting specific needs. Some of them gravitated toward the prophetic gifts. Some gravitated toward those priestly gifts. And some a little bit more toward that kingly or administrative gift. But they were all right. He said, so what do? Well, we put them in a Baptist church and let them duke it out in a business meeting. No, that's not the way to solve it. We actually teamed them up, and Paul is saying if we get along well with one another, we want all three of those people on the same team because then you might really get something done. I see that even in our ministry coordinating team that meets monthly. A lot of differences in the representation there, and yet we get great ideas coming because people see things differently on how we should approach a specific need. And I love that. That's the way the body of Christ should be. So the first is your gravitational approach toward ministry. What do you gravitate toward? You know about sympathetic vibration? That if you tune one guitar string at the exact same length to the same pitch, and if you strike that tone on this guitar, this will vibrate as well because it travels through the airwaves. Sympathetic vibration. There's some of us that our hearts just tend to vibrate with certain needs. We gravitate toward that specific need or the way of meeting the need. So what's your gravitational approach? Do you gravitate toward evangelism or prophetic things? You want to proclaim truth? That's how you want to solve the problem? That's great. You probably lump into that category over the prophetic gifts. If you gravitate toward more, hey, let's meet some practical needs, then maybe you're in the priestly category. If you say, how about let's organize folks? I get so dissatisfied because people are just not organized enough around there. Good. Maybe you're the one to help organize them. Right. So all three of those things are needed, but it's your gravitational approach. Second, in addition to your gravitational approach, the work you enjoy. Not necessarily while you're doing it, but the reward you get from having done it. I like to write. I've written quite a bit, but I don't like some of the writing process. It's grueling, it's hard work, it requires editing, it requires my looking at something and saying, it's still not clear. And if it's not clear to me, I know it's not going to be clear out there. So I need to go back to it again and get back to the drawing board, and sometimes I have to throw away the first 3 paragraphs until I finally got my opening thought. It's hard work, and sometimes it's frustrating. Joy will know that if I'm around the house and if I'm pacing and I'm coming in for another cup of coffee in the kitchen and I'm going, rucka, sassafrassa, and she'll say, you struggling with the sermon this week? How'd you guess? Sassafrassa. because it's hard work. And yet, when you finally polished it and you've crafted it and you feel like this is in the right place and I think this is going to connect with our listeners and I think this analogy will help unpack that and make it more clear, now we're on the right track. Then the reward is somebody comes up to you after a sermon that you've written and you've spent 20 hours working on and they say, God spoke to me through that, Pastor, thank you. Amen. And you go, I like having written. I don't necessarily like writing. See what I'm talking about? Yeah. Sometimes we do a job even though we know it's going to create lots of anxiety for a while. It's going to be hard work for a while, but we love it so much, the reward we get having done it, that we keep doing it. So think to yourself, what is something like that you enjoy? Chances are things that build into that are also built into your spiritual gift mix. And then third, in addition to your gravitational approach, what do you resonate with? The work you enjoy, the rewards it gives you. Thirdly, the tasks that other people tell you you do well. I learned about age 12 or 13 that if I wanted really solid feedback from somebody, honest feedback, I should not go to my mother. Because she thought I could hang the moon. Oh, honey, you did such a great job with that. And somebody else would say, yeah, it was not bad. I got to college and I started taking some classes and I thought that they were going to say, you did such a great job. And there's a red pencil on my papers and stuff. And I thought, okay, that's honesty. So you need to find out from people that you're speaking with, honestly speaking, what do you think I do well? Because you don't want to just take the word of the yes people in your life. So 3 practical questions, and they're so simple. They're based on what we just talked about. What approaches do I gravitate toward? Prophetic, priestly, or kingly? What work do I really enjoy, or at least not necessarily while I'm doing it, but the rewards I get from it? And then what do others tell me I do well? If you start exploring those things together in discussions with real people, like Callie and Joy and I did in our living room, that's when all of a sudden it starts to become a little bit more clear in your mind how this practicum starts to flesh out instead of being all just philosophic. Here's the challenge. Ask yourself those questions. Seek God's character above all, like Paul tells us to. Season all of your gifts, and don't just season them, permeate them with grace and become a living sacrifice.
Heavenly Father, I pray that whoever's listening just now will surrender themselves completely into your capable hands, that they will find their shape, and that they'll find the fit in the body of Christ wherever they're located, so that additional congregations will continue to thrive doing the things that you've called them to do to reveal yourself and your great love and your redemption and your grace to many, many more people around the world. These things I pray in Jesus' name.